But what about the DNA? Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover hidden truths, and explore why they matter. I'm Bacon Bears, and today we're diving straight into episode 3 of the four-part series. I said part of the four-part series from Netflix called American Manhunt, O.J. Simpson. They open this episode by introducing us to a man named Bill Thompson, a defense lawyer and a DNA specialist who explains where DNA evidence stood at the time. He mentions that the DNA test started being conducted around 1988, 1989, so you know your girl had to look into it. And what I found was actually DNA was first used in a criminal case in 1986 in the UK during the investigation of the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. Geneticist Alec Jeffreys developed DNA fingerprinting, and police used it to test crime scene samples. And this groundbreaking technique not only proved that their prime suspect, Richard Buckland, was innocent, but it also led to the first ever conviction using DNA evidence, identifying the real killer, Colin Pitchfork. And this case revolutionized forensic science, proving that DNA could both exonerate the innocent and convict the guilty. Honestly, I feel like I should do an episode on just that because it is so interesting. Anyway, one thing we need to remember, and I've talked about this before, is that even though there was an overwhelming amount of DNA evidence against OJ, Bill mentions that there were well over 50 samples, but DNA was still new to the public in criminal trials in 1994. So how do you defend someone with a mountain of DNA against them? Well, you start by spinning a narrative that it was planted. Easy. I knew that. And looking at the evidence now in 2025 with everything we know, it's insane. Insane. And then Bill says, enter Fuhrman. As we've discussed before, the LAPD had a long history of racial bias and abhorrent behavior, and the defense team needed someone to blame. And that's when they set their sights on Mark Fuhrman, digging up everything that they could find on him. He was a white LAPD officer, a witness in the case, and the one thing that both the defense and prosecution will always try to do is discredit witnesses by any means necessary. And boy, did they find something. According to an article from spokesman.com, I'll have the link down below. In 1983, LAPD detective Mark Fuhrman applied for a stress-related disability pension, citing severe emotional distress. During his evaluation, he admitted to torturing suspects and deceiving internal affairs investigators about violent incidents. Fuhrman even stated himself, quote, "I answer everything with violence. Just seems like I can't tolerate anybody or anything anymore," unquote. So in short, he was trying to convince the department that he was too unstable to be a cop anymore. And yet, despite these shocking claims, the Los Angeles Police Department and the city's Board of Pension Commissioners denied his application, even though a department psychiatrist recommended that Fuhrman should never carry a weapon again. And within months, he was back on active duty in West Los Angeles. Now, imagine your defense team finding this little nugget, especially since Mark Fuhrman was also the one who found the second glove at OJ's house. The documentary also shows the sections of the lawsuit where Fuhrman used racial slurs, specifically referencing the Black community. In one part, it states, quote, "Those people disgust me," unquote. And this is about the very community that he was sworn to serve and protect. Now, this is a detective in a high-profile murder case against O.J. Simpson, a Black man. The New Yorker published an article about Fuhrman, and the defense seized the opportunity to frame him in an even more racially charged light. And their goal, to paint Fuhrman, which they didn't have to work very hard at, as a racist officer who would plant evidence against O.J. Simpson. And let's not forget, just a few years earlier, the Rodney King trial had been decided by an all-white jury, which sparked national outrage. Gil Garcetti knew that the public perception of bias in the legal system was at an all-time high. So when it came to OJ's trial, Garcetti made it a point to strategically select a jury pool that was diverse, knowing the public was already vocal about the racial bias they saw in the justice system. Another major challenge that they faced was jury selection. This was a crime that was impossible to escape. It was everywhere. It dominated the tabloids, the news, and everyday conversation. So not only did they need to find a diverse jury pool, but they also had to find jurors who weren't already biased by everything that they had seen in the media. Because at the end of the day, jury selection can make or break your case. Now, Carl E. Douglas comes on to talk about the jury selection. And when he was told that the juror that would be favorable to OJ was black women, he was like, there's no way. He points out that OJ is a black man who left his black wife for a white woman. He didn't associate himself with the black community at all. So how could black women be on his side? And historically, throughout Marcia Clark's career, she had resonated with black women in the community. She had successfully secured convictions from predominantly black female juries, even in cases against black defendants. However, this case was different. Black women understood firsthand what black men in their community faced when it came to unfair treatment by the police. And when the prosecution brought in a jury consultant, they were blunt. Black women are going to be your nightmare in this case. But Marcia Clark was confident. She believed that she could win them over. And ultimately, the final jury consisted of 6 black women, 2 black men, 1 white woman, 1 Hispanic man, 1 mixed race woman, and 1 mixed race man. And Carl E. Douglas recalls an interaction with OJ after he saw the jury that had been selected. And OJ turned to him and said, "If this jury convicts me, maybe I did do it." But with that, we're introduced to the Honorable Judge Lance Ito. Judge Lance Ito was chosen for the O.J. Simpson trial because of his extensive experience handling major criminal cases in Los Angeles. He became a judge in 1987 and was known for being fair and knowledgeable. Although the court randomly assigned him to this case, his experience with high-profile, complex trials made him a strong fit for what was about to become one of the biggest trials in history. Everyone knew that this was going to be a spectacle. So they needed someone on the bench who could keep it under control. And then we get to sit down with Christopher Darden, who's a black attorney who was added to the prosecution team. But he wasn't originally supposed to be there. The role was initially given to another prosecutor, Bill Hodgman, but due to health issues, Hodgman had to step back, and that's when they brought in Darden. Now, if you ask the prosecution, they'll tell you that Christopher Darden was an incredibly skilled attorney who hadn't lost a felony case in 15 years. But if you ask the defense, they'd say he was nothing more than what they called a token black guy. At least they said that's what OJ called him, token. And he was added to the team just to appeal to the mostly black jury. Then came January 1995 opening statements. People grabbed their popcorn, stopped what they were doing, and they watched this trial play out like a soap opera. There were helicopters overhead. The media was everywhere. And outside the courthouse, bystanders flooded the streets, holding signs, chanting, and turning this whole thing into pure chaos. For opening statements for the prosecution, Christopher Darden comes up, and there's an interview with one of the women who was on the jury, and she's a black woman, and she recalls her immediate reaction when Darden was introduced. And she says, as soon as they brought him in, I was like, why are you bringing him in? They're probably playing the race card. Which was such an interesting thing to say because that's exactly what the defense was doing. And to be honest, at this time in this setting, there's really no other way to handle this case. Everything was about race. But in Christopher Darden's opening statement, he described O.J. Simpson as having 2 sides. One as a famous, well-liked celebrity, and the other as a controlling and abusive partner. Darden argued that Simpson's jealousy was what led to the murders, stating, if he couldn't have her, nobody else could. To drive this point home, he played a chilling 911 call from January 1st of 1989, where Nicole Brown Simpson told police, he's going to beat the shit out of me. This call was used to prove his history of violence against her. Then you have Johnny Cochran's opening statement for the defense. He argues that O.J. Simpson was being framed by the LAPD due to racial bias. Cochran claims that the police investigation was deeply flawed and that the evidence against Simpson could not be trusted. And his focus? Detective Mark Fuhrman. He highlighted Fuhrman's history of using racial slurs and accused him of planting evidence to make Simpson look guilty. Then Marcia Clark takes the floor. She lays out the evidence linking O.J. Simpson to the murders of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman, telling the jury there is a mountain of evidence proving his guilt. This included DNA evidence, blood samples, forensic trails. Clark describes how a trail of blood led from the crime scene to Simpson's home directly tying him to the murders. She also addressed Simpson's history of domestic violence, arguing that it was a key motive. She pointed out that Nicole had called 911 a total of 8 times to report domestic abuse. All of it documented. But Cochran pushed back. He told the jury there were no official charges of domestic abuse, calling the prosecution's theory baseless. That is an outright lie. Quote, they don't have motive. They're just trying to make one up. And listen, I have so much anger towards defense attorneys. Unless, of course, I ever need one. Then I'm sure I'll love them, but I digress. Because let's talk about it. For the record, O.J. Simpson was charged with domestic violence in 1989 after an incident where he physically assaulted Nicole Brown Simpson on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1989. Nicole had called 911, reporting that Simpson had beaten her. And when police arrived, they found her bruised and visibly injured. And Simpson pleads no contest. And he was sentenced to community service, probation, and ordered to attend domestic violence counseling. And despite this, reports indicate that the abuse continued in the years leading up to Nicole's murder in 1994. Aside from securing a jury, the prosecution also had to gather many witnesses as possible against O.J., but there's a problem. O.J. is one of the most beloved figures in America. There weren't going to be a lot of friends, associates, or acquaintances who were willing to testify against him. And one person that they really wanted was Ron Shipp. Ron had been a friend of O.J.'s since he was 15 years old. He didn't want to testify. He just wanted to wash his hands of this entire situation and be done with it. But the reason that the prosecution wanted him so bad was because he was ex-LAPD. He was close to both O.J. and Nicole. He had seen the inner workings of their relationship. And Christopher Darden asked Ron to come down to the office to talk. And Ron agrees. And at some point, Christopher Darden leaves the office and Ron Shipp notices a file sitting on the table. And out of curiosity, he opens it. And that was the moment that everything changed. Inside of the file were the photos of Nicole's body. And this wasn't just a crime scene victim. This was Nicole Brown, his friend, a woman he had spent so much time with. And that's when he made the decision to take the stand. And what an impossible place to be, right? He and OJ are like brothers. They had shared years of friendship, love, and trust. And now he's sitting on the stand looking directly at a man he once saw as family, knowing what he had just seen in those crime scene photos. It had to be one of the most gut-wrenching moments of his life. Even watching interviews today, you can still see that this absolutely tears him apart. While on the stand, Christopher Darden asked Ron about a conversation he had had with Nicole. And we've talked about this before in a previous video, but Nicole had confided in Ron that OJ had hit her. Ron later confronted OJ about it, and instead of outright denying it, OJ responded with, yeah, we may have had a moment, but, you know, Nicole's the aggressor. Carl E. Douglas cross-examines Ron Shipp, and he tore Ron apart. They paint him as an alcoholic. They questioned whether he was really OJ's friend. I believe at some point they had made reference to an affair, but Ron was painted as the villain. And why? Because according to Ron himself, he said he went against the race. There was a ton of backlash. And I have to say it was incredibly brave for him to sit up there on the stand and tell the truth about someone that he once loved like a brother, and then to be publicly smeared for it. But Ron stood by his decision, and on the stand, he said, I'm doing this for my peace of mind. I will not have the blood of Nicole on Ron Shipp. This was a woman who was nearly decapitated. At the end of the day, you have to do the right thing. And for Ron, that meant testifying. As the trial continues, the prosecution works to show the world who OJ really is. They played the infamous 911 call. You can hear OJ actively assaulting Nicole while she was on the phone with 911. And as the audio played, the cameras caught Nicole's mother's reaction. I cannot even imagine what it must have been like to sit there as a mother listening to the audio of your daughter getting viciously attacked by her husband. And then you have Denise Brown, Nicole's sister, who takes the stand. And she recalled firsthand the abuse that she had witnessed and that it was horrific. The reason that I make these videos is because there is so much we can learn from each individual situation. More information means better decisions. In this case, it's a case of domestic violence turned fatal. According to the Emory School of Medicine, a woman is beaten every 9 seconds. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, results in nearly 1,300 deaths a year. More than 3 women are killed by their husbands or boyfriends every single day. And despite the severe underreporting of IPV, calls related to domestic violence make up about half of all violent crime calls to police departments. And let's be clear, it's not just women who are victims of intimate partner violence. 1 in 20 men are killed by their intimate partners. And the hardest part of this reality is most victims don't realize how bad it is until they're too deep in it. It's an extremely hard cycle to escape. And if they do escape, like Nicole did, sometimes their abuser still refuses to let them go. OJ stalked her. He harassed her. He couldn't just let her be. And for victims like Nicole Brown, sometimes there is no escape. And I think people who haven't experienced that level of abuse really can't comprehend it, because the biggest example of that is when people ask, well, why didn't they just leave? Nicole Brown did leave. She left. She called the police. She filed for divorce. And in the trial, the prosecution laid it all out. Witness testimony of the abuse, photos of her bruised face, reports of her hiding in the bushes in fear when the police showed up, her personal diary documenting the violence, the 911 calls where she begged for help. Nicole did everything she was supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough. Now, we love a good timeline on this channel, so thankfully that's exactly what the documentary gives us next. Now, the prosecution's job was to prove that OJ had more than enough time to commit this crime. So we have Sunday, June 12th of 1994. Between 6:30 and 8:30 p.m., Nicole Brown Simpson attends her daughter's dance recital. OJ Simpson, their children, and several family and friends are also present. Denise Brown later claims that OJ sat behind them, but he left abruptly. He was also informed that he was not invited to dinner with the Brown family, so he went home and he had food with Kato Kalin. But he was venting to Kato about how upset he was over what Nicole was wearing at the dance recital. After the recital, Nicole and her family go to the Mezzaluna, a restaurant in Brentwood. 9:09 p.m., Kato Kalin and OJ go to McDonald's to get something to eat. At 9:15 p.m., Nicole and her children return home, and she calls Mezzaluna to ask about her mother's glasses, which got left behind. Ronald Goldman, a waiter at Mezzaluna, offers to bring them to Nicole's house. And by 9:35, Kato returns home to eat his food inside alone. OJ decides not to go inside with him. At 9:50 p.m., Ron Goldman finishes his shift at Mezzaluna and leaves to bring the glasses to Nicole. From 10:15 to 10:40, neighbors hear a dog barking near Nicole's home. At 11:05, OJ gets picked up by his limo driver who had been waiting outside for a while. The driver later stated that he saw a man matching OJ's height, build, and ethnicity walk into the house before OJ finally came out. And the police later tested the route, driving from Nicole's house to OJ's house. They did this while obeying traffic laws, no speeding, no shortcuts, and they still made it in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This means that OJ had an entire hour and 10 minutes to commit this crime, and that is a lot of time. The prosecution argued that OJ wanted to create an alibi by being on a plane to Chicago when Nicole and Ron's bodies were found. Then they introduced Jill Shively, a witness who claimed she saw OJ leaving Nicole's house in the white Bronco, but she unfortunately sold her story to the press, and Marcia Clark was pissed. I'd be pissed, to be honest with you. She was convinced that Jill had just blown her case, and because of that, she was never called to testify. And honestly, I get it. Like, if I was sitting in a jury box and a witness on the stand had already sold their story, I don't know if their testimony would hold any weight for me either. Let me know in the comments. Does that change anything for you? I mean, if you want to sell it after this is all over, then fine. But before, then the defense called the lead detectives from robbery and homicide, which are Tom Lang and Philip Van Adder, and their goal to spin the narrative that the cops had only ever focused on OJ and that they never even considered any other suspects. But when Tom Lang was asked about this, he shut that down quickly. He's like, there wasn't any evidence that led to anywhere other than OJ. That's also possible. But here's the thing. These are 2 white detectives with a black suspect, And the defense's entire strategy was to paint the police as racist and incompetent. And that argument was working. Then the documentary shifts to the media frenzy and the consumerism surrounding this case. And honestly, holy shit. You had OJ-themed hats. You had a Judge Lance Ito Jell-O mold. And when you think it can't get any worse, OJ's agent, Mike Gilbert, comes on and says they made millions. Millions. From OJ signing footballs, signing birthday cards, selling anything and everything with his name on it. And Fred Goldman came out, Ron Goldman's dad, and called it what it was. Disgusting. And honestly, we've never seen anything quite like it since. It was such a wild time. People wanted a piece of OJ, a man suspected of a double homicide. It's the same energy as when Netflix dropped that Dahmer miniseries, and suddenly girls on TikTok were like, oh my God, he's so hot. What are we doing? Or Wade Wilson. Women online were obsessed with him just because he's what they would consider good looking, I guess. But I have to tell you, when I was going through the discovery in the Watts family case and the amount of letters that women wrote to Chris, this man murdered his wife and 3 of his babies. I don't understand. I mean, it even affected the car market. The sales of white Ford Broncos literally doubled at some of these dealerships. And okay, I'll admit the new Bronco in 2025 does look pretty sweet. It does. But I can't unsee this connection. I actually have a friend who owns one, and I told her, I'm like, I really want to drive it and try it out. And she's like, yeah, it's pretty great. I love it. But in my brain, these two things, OJ and the Bronco, will forever be linked. Unfortunate for Ford, I guess. I don't know. And while people were out here making Jell-O molds of Judge Ito and SNL was turning the trial into a joke, the media also started fixating on the key players inside of the courtroom. Christopher Darden later said, now people know where I live. They're coming to my house. And as a man with a family, he was getting death threats. This case wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle. This picture right here is how the Goldman family had to mourn the loss of a son, the loss of a brother. The Browns didn't just have to sit in a courtroom for hours listening to graphic details of what happened to their daughter, their sister, their friend. They also had to watch as the defense tried to protect the man they believe had killed her. And then after all of that, they would go home only to find people outside of their houses screaming, trying to record them, and turning their grief into a profit. Carl E. Douglas says something that has been echoed in so many documentaries and by so many Black voices. If OJ was on trial for killing his first wife, Marguerite, who was Black, none of us would be here because none of us would care. And even in 2025, the media still prioritizes crimes involving white women over Black women, even though Black women go missing or become victims of violent crime at higher rates. There's even a term for it. It's called missing white woman syndrome. When a white woman goes missing, it's everywhere. News coverage, social media. The case gets attention, public pressure, and faster investigations. Black women make up less than 15% of the U.S. population. Yet they account for over 1/3 of all missing women cases. Their stories rarely make national headlines. Their cases are often unsolved for longer. Their families don't receive the same level of public help or law enforcement urgency. And it's a reality that needs to be changed for everybody. Everybody deserves the same amount of justice. The prosecution knew how racially charged everything was, and they also knew that at some point they were going to have to call Mark Fuhrman to the stand. Fuhrman was in photos and evidence. He was the one who found the second glove at OJ's house. But here's the thing. This wasn't even his case. He was relieved from the investigation when it was handed over to robbery and homicide. He had less to do with this case than the defense wanted you to think. Christopher Darden said it best. Mark Fuhrman has little to do with this case, yet we're going back 15 years to ask if he's ever made a racial slur, if he's ever shown racial bias, and we're going to hold it against him. But that's exactly what the defense did. Christopher Darden said it himself, that the slurs that Mark Fuhrman used, they are dirty, filthy words. And he knew the impact that it would have. He says, quote, it blinds people and it's going to blind the jury, unquote. And I've talked about this before. And as much as I understand what he was trying to say, his argument essentially implied that the Black community couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions. Christopher Darden knew that if they brought race into this trial, that they couldn't win. Because at that point, they weren't even trying O.J. Simpson for a double homicide. They were trying a race case. And as Darden was making this argument to the judge, O.J. sat in his chair just staring at him. It made me so wildly uncomfortable. And Johnny Cochran responds, and he comes out and he's pissed. He tore into Darden. And he says, quote, "What Mr. Darden has said is demeaning to African Americans as a group," unquote. And then he took it even further. Quote, "I want to apologize to African Americans across this country," unquote. And to really drive it home, he called Darden an apologist for Mark Fuhrman. Finally, on March 9th of 1995, Mark Fuhrman takes the stand. He walked through everything that happened in the investigation until it was time for cross-examination. And who was waiting for him? F. Lee Bailey, maybe one of the best defense attorneys of all time. They go straight into Fuhrman's racial remarks. And they had witnesses lined up ready to testify that Fuhrman had used these racial slurs. And when asked about it, Mark lies. He lies. And Mark Fuhrman had said something in another documentary that has stuck with me. And he said, either I'm going to be painted as a liar or I'm going to be painted as a racist. And I don't know which is worse. I mean, to me, when it comes to racism, I never understand when people are outwardly racist and then deny it. That has never made sense to me. If you believe it wholeheartedly, just say it out loud then. And in this case, if that's what he felt and that's what he said, then he should have just been honest about it. Yeah. You can paint me as a racist. That's fine. That's what I said. But you can't paint me as a liar. And sitting in that jury box at the time, you have to ask yourself, would it have been better for Mark Fuhrman, to be honest, to come clean about the fact that he had a racial bias? The same bias that led him to claim he shouldn't have even been working for the LAPD anymore? Could that have actually helped the prosecution's case? And honestly, I don't know. Because even if he is honest to a fault, even if he admitted everything, the bottom line is he still had racial bias. I don't know if there's anything that could have helped Mark Fuhrman. And if things weren't already bad enough, we get to the Mark Fuhrman tapes. He's heard actively using the slurs, saying nasty, disgusting things. So now it's not just that he's a liar because he lied on the stand. And it's not just that he's a racist because his own words prove that. Now he's both a liar and a racist. I think the only thing that could have saved Mark Fuhrman at that moment would have been to admit to what he said and just been like, yeah, I've said it. I've used these terms in the past. Maybe, if he's ashamed of them, say, I'm ashamed of what I've said. I've said these things regrettably. But from a jury standpoint, I don't know if that changes anything. And the defense, because of this, is now able to plant the question in the jury's minds. If he lied about this, is it possible that he lied about planting evidence? Could he plant evidence because he has a racial bias against O.J. Simpson? It's like all these little breadcrumbs that they're just leaving for the jury. And what is that? Say it with me, folks. Reasonable doubt. And Christopher Darden comes out and he says, I could defend a racist. Actually, he said something else. I don't know if I can say it on YouTube, but he follows it up with, I could defend him, I suppose, as long as he's honest. But here's the thing. The other evidence wasn't ever really looked at. With DNA evidence, Mark Fuhrman's DNA wasn't found anywhere on the glove. So if you want to argue that he planted the glove, okay, all right, I'll see you there. Maybe he wore gloves or he used tweezers to place it there or some other way. I'll entertain that theory. But then explain this. How did he plant both Ronald Goldman's blood and Nicole Brown's blood inside the Bronco? How did he plant OJ's blood at Nicole's house? How did he plant the shoe prints leading away from the scene, matching shoes OJ owned? There was so much more evidence, but they focused on the glove. The only time Mark Fuhrman was alone. And the only time that Mark Fuhrman was ever alone was when he walked behind the south side of the house to check something. Why? Because Kato Kalin had said he heard a loud bang on the wall. He thought it was an earthquake or someone hitting the house. So Fuhrman went to check. But at this point, the documentary makes it clear Mark Fuhrman is on trial now, not O.J. Simpson. And here's the thing. Mark Fuhrman can be a racist. and O.J. Simpson can be a killer. Two things can be true. I just spit. I'm so sorry. But two things can be true. With all the tapes of Mark Fuhrman making racist remarks, the defense drilled one thing into the jury's minds. If they don't have the glove, they don't have a case, which isn't true. Because even without the glove, they had the Bronco, OJ's DNA at the crime scene, his shoes with the shoe prints and his size, and they were like an exclusive pair of shoes. There were so many other things that they could have looked at. And it's so easy to look back at this case through the lens of 2025, knowing everything we know now. And at the same time, it's disheartening because I think a good majority of people believe that OJ did this. Whether he was alone or not, the consensus is that OJ was a part of this. But because the LAPD had a history of treating the Black community the way that they did, this case went the way that it did. And here's what it really comes down to. If the LAPD had actually served and protected their communities like they swore they would when they took their oaths as police officers, the verdict at the end of this case might have been very different. The third installment of this series, and I'll say it again, 10 out of 10. This documentary is so good. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Please go watch it if you have Netflix. And if you missed episode 1 and 2, make sure that you go watch them and come back. Let me know what you think. If you liked what you saw here today, don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion.